Good afternoon, welcome. It is indeed my honor to welcome Dr. Robert Darnton to the Wallot-Sylvestre seminar series today.
First, a few words about the Wallot-Sylvestre seminar series.
This seminar series was created by the second Librarian Archivist of Canada, Dr. Daniel Caron, and it honors Jean-Pierre Wallot, Canada's sixth National Archivist, and Guy Sylvestre, our second National Librarian. The work of these two men is celebrated as we continue their legacy by encouraging and spreading strategic thinking in the fields of information science, archival science, and history. Jean-Pierre Wallot and I were colleagues at the Université de Montréal in the late 70s. Following a distinguished academic career, Jean-Pierre was appointed the Dominion Archivist of Canada in 1985. Described by one historian as an archival giant, Dr. Wallot is best known for his work in developing the National Archives Act and the building of the Preservation Center in Gatineau, Quebec. He also made great strides towards the management of electronic records and Canada's audiovisual heritage. Joseph Jean-Guy Sylvestre was appointed as Canada's National Librarian in 1968. His dream was the creation of a decentralized network of Canadian libraries supported by the National Library. To this end, he worked on the creation of bibliographic standards for the Union Catalog and for library systems throughout Canada. He also expanded the National Library's collection during the 70s and early 80s to such an extent that by the end of his tenure, the library was a major national cultural institution with rich and diverse collections of Canadian social sciences and the humanities. The work of those two distinguished gentlemen brought international attention to the Canadian approach to collection, preservation, and service, and their work continues to influence the work we carry out today. So, to present our speaker, now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Parliamentary Librarian, Sonia Leroux, to the podium. Sonia.
Thank you, Guy. I was thrilled when I was asked to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Robert Darnton. I knew that he would attract a lot of people, and I'm happy to see such a large number of admirers here with us today, because his talk will no doubt be fascinating.
And I'm also happy to welcome you to the renovated reading room at Librarian Archives. I don't know if you noticed, but I think it seems fitting that Professor Darnton will be speaking to us in a room which features the Pellan murals that were painted by the iconic Quebec artist Alfred Pellan. On the western wall, we have the alphabet, and on the eastern wall, knowledge. And when Professor Darnton left his position as a university librarian at Harvard just this year, he said that knowledge should be seen as a natural resource. And as the author or co-author of some 27 books, I would say he has some familiarity with the alphabet. So I hope that he feels very at home here with us today. It won't be easy to try and sum up Professor Darnton's achievement throughout his distinguished career, but I'll give it a try.
As a historian, long-standing champion of books, and pioneer in the area of digital libraries, Professor Darnton has consistently and effectively argued that books and libraries are here to stay. As a Rhodes Scholar, he graduated from Harvard and Oxford. Then he taught at Princeton University from 1968 to 2007. In 2007, he became the Carl H. Pforzheimer Professor and University Librarian Emeritus of Harvard University until he retired earlier this year. He has been a visiting professor or fellow at many universities and institutes for advanced study, and among his many other activities, he was trustee of the New York Public Library and the Oxford University Press, as well as president of the American Historical Association and of the International Society for 18th Century Studies.
He has been honored many times, having received the MacArthur Prize Fellowship, a National Book Critics Cycle Award, and election to the French Legion of Honor. by the way, he speaks beautiful French. President Obama conferred the National Humanities Medal on him in 2012, and in 2013 he received the Del Duca World Prize in Humanities, awarded by the Institut de France. His book credits are too numerous to list, but his most popular work, The Great Cat Massacre, and other episodes in French cultural history, has been translated into 18 languages. Today he will be speaking to us about libraries, books, and the digital future. So without further ado, and because I know we're all anxious to listen to what he has to say, may I introduce you our distinguished guest, Professor Robert Dunn.
Well, I may need some help, of course, because I'll be talking about the digital world. Well, I guess I'll just jump right in then. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Leroux, Mr. Berthiaume, thank you for this invitation. It is an honor for me to speak to you. I'll speak in English, and I hope the translation will work.
So let's jump into a big subject. Despite a lot of loose talk about the death of the book and the obsolescence of libraries, books and libraries are more important than ever in the current digital environment if only we can get it right. I would like to develop this argument by looking backward into history and forward into the creation of a new kind of library, the Digital Public Library of America. So let's begin with the history. The historical importance of libraries may seem obvious. Take a tour of any American or Canadian library today, and you will immediately get the point. The library stands at the center of the campus, and it occupies a corresponding place at the very heart of the intellectual life of the university. It pumps intellectual energy into every corner of the campus, including laboratories where scientists download messages without knowing that they come from the library. At Harvard, the university owes its very name to its library, a collection of 400 books that was left to this tiny academy by one John Harvard in 1638. And the university grew up around this core of learning. Today, 377 years and 20 million volumes later, we recognize that we owe the university's greatness, above all, to the intellectual riches built up over many generations and stored in the largest university library system in the world. But I don't mean to deviate into what could be called institutional bragging. You know, that sometimes happens with librarians. How many volumes do you have? How many e-books do you have? Instead, I want to ask a question. Shouldn't Harvard's library, the riches in these great collections and in the collections of all research libraries, be considered as a national and as an international asset? Shouldn't their intellectual wealth be shared? Now, for most of history, you'll see the point of these strange photos in a minute, I hope. For most of history, that intellectual wealth was restricted to a privileged few. And contrary to common belief, the history of libraries is not one great trajectory that goes up and up into indefinite progress. In fact, there were down moments, and I would just like to remind you of some of the downward, unfortunate moments in the histories of libraries. For example, from what little we know about the ancient Library of Alexandria, it functioned primarily to store texts and not to make them available to readers. It did admit a few scholars, we don't know much about it, but its main purpose probably was to glorify the Ptolemaic dynasty. And the same principle applied to the Chinese attempt to create a library that would contain all the books in the world. That is, of course, the Chinese world. The Qing Emperor, Qin Lung, set out to do that by confiscating books from his subjects on a gigantic scale between 1772 and 1778. He kept everything that glorified the Qing dynasty, and he burned everything that was critical to the Qings or favorable to the Mings. It was a catastrophe for the books kept in the Chinese tradition. And things like that have been going on frequently in Czechoslovakia right after World War II. Books were confiscated from every library imaginable, and every book that was in any way critical to the official party line was destroyed. 7,500 books went up in flames, and that was little compared to the 24 million books destroyed in Soviet libraries during Stalin's Great Terror of 1938 to 39. So there have been terrible moments in the history of libraries. But of course, it's a happy history in most respects. The oldest libraries contributed enormously to civilization by building up and conserving books. But they kept their books behind locked doors and thick walls, which removed them from outsiders. When I was a student at Oxford, and that's me, the person that you see trying to climb in a wall, the massive gate of my college, St. John's College, slammed shut at 10 o'clock. If you happened to be outside the walls, too bad for you, you had to climb in. And that was a daunting experience because the walls were 10 to 15 feet high and covered at the top with spikes. So what you see in this photo, we're posing, a friend of mine is helping me to get through one of the secret passages that were possible, but you had to slide between revolving spikes and downward spikes. Not an easy thing. So as an accompaniment to the rest of my remarks, I would flash more pictures of Oxford's walls and spikes. This is the University Library, the Bodleian, lots of spikes, in the background crenellations. It all looks as though they are castles, fortresses, intended to keep the public out while keeping the privileged in. So people looked into these privileged areas that were libraries through gates and sometimes just imagined them on the other side of walls with spikes. And I can go on and on, showing you how libraries were designed to keep the public out. But what I really want to discuss is, of course, the invisible barriers to knowledge stored in research libraries. Libraries frequently keep outsiders outside by all sorts of measures. Restrictive qualifications for entry, payment to obtain a reader's card, and a general atmosphere of intimidation. Ordinary folk hesitate to brave these barriers. They're kept at a distance by the learned elite who wear an air of effortless superiority, which I think corresponds to what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called la distinction. But a counter tendency began to build up force in the age of enlightenment. That was when philosophers like Condorcet understood the diffusion of knowledge to be the most important force in history, one that would extend everywhere, destroying prejudice and promoting progress. And that faith of Condorcet's was shared by the founding fathers of the United States, and notably Condorcet's friend Thomas Jefferson, who declared, I quote, "The field of knowledge is the common property of mankind," end quote. As the founders understood it, the health of the Republic depended on a well-informed citizenry, and the spread of light was commensurate with the reading of books. Now, in retrospect, that vision looks utopian. Ordinary readers were allowed inside the French Royal Library in 1692, so you've got the beginning in the Age of Enlightenment of an opening up of access to knowledge. The British Museum opened in 1759. In the United States, the first great public library was that of Boston, the Boston Public Library, which opened to readers in 1848 and even let them take the books home with them. The New York Public Library opened its doors in 1911 to a very varied reading public. I mean, people who often were fresh off the boats as immigrants and could just walk in off the street in order to get books in their native languages. However, this kind of access to knowledge depended on a limited technology, the printing press. Most people in the 18th century could not read, and those who could read usually could not afford the price of a book. Today we have the internet. We now have it in our power to realize what was a utopian vision in the Age of Enlightenment. As an example of what can now be accomplished, consider the difference between two great encyclopedias. The Encyclopédie, edited by Diderot, was the Bible of the Enlightenment, and it was a marvel of intellectual production 250 years ago. 17 volumes of text by about 200 contributors. But it cost 980 livres tournois, the equivalent of 2.5 years of wages for an ordinary laborer. Wikipedia now contains 30 million articles by 77,000 active contributors, and it reaches 365 million readers free of charge. So a new ideal of openness is transforming the world of knowledge. But just as a reminder of how closed it used to be, some more spikes and walls. The origins of this ideal go back to the Enlightenment vision of a republic of letters, that is to say, in principle, a free intellectual realm with no police force, no boundaries, no exclusiveness. But in practice, of course, only a tiny elite could enjoy citizenship in this republic during the 18th century. Today, we have open universities, open source software, open metadata, open access journals, and the beginnings of an open information highway. Unfortunately, however, this tendency also has a darker side, because in some ways, access to knowledge is being closed. What, I ask you, is the cost of an average subscription to a chemical journal today? Answer, $4,044 for 1 year's subscription. What was it in 1970? $33 a year. Inflation accounts for only a small part of that increase. During the last 25 years, the price of academic periodicals went up at 4 times the rate of inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. 1 year's subscription to the Journal of Comparative Neurology, I'm sure you all keep it under your pillow at night, costs $30,860, the equivalent of 600 monographs. 3 giant publishers, Reed Elsevier, Wiley, Blackwell, and Springer, now publish 42% of all academic articles, and they make giant profits from them. In 2014, Elsevier turned a 39% profit on an income of £2.1 billion sterling, and that just from its science, technology, and medical journals. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming that this ruinous increase in the price of journals can be explained by greed on the part of the publishers. They are doing their job, returning the greatest possible profit to their shareholders. Perhaps they should be congratulated for doing it so well. But I think their success should give us pause, because it illustrates the negative counterpart to the trend toward openness that I was just celebrating, namely commercialization, a trend toward closing access to knowledge. The output of articles in medical science doubles every 3 to 4 years. So yes, more knowledge is constantly being produced, but an increasingly small proportion of that knowledge is available to the public. Why? Because libraries can no longer afford to pay the prices. The average price of a medical journal was $12 in 1970. It's now $1,470. All over, at least the United States, but I suspect Canada as well, libraries are canceling subscriptions to academic journals because they are caught between decreasing budgets and increasing costs. The logic of the bottom line is inescapable, but there is a higher logic that deserves consideration, namely that the public should have access to knowledge produced with public funds. The U.S. Congress acted on that principle in 2008 when it required that articles based on grants from the National Institutes of Health be made available from an open access repository, PubMed Central. But lobbyists for the publishers blunted that requirement by getting the NIH to accept a 12-month embargo to prevent public accessibility long enough for them to cream off the profits. Lobbyists are still at work trying to block the Fair Access to Science and Technology Research Act, FASTER it's called, which would give the public free access to the publication of all research funded by federal agencies with budgets of $100 million or more. Will this act make it through Congress? No one knows, but no one's feeling optimistic. The battle over journal prices illustrates a conflict between 2 tendencies that will, I think, determine the digital future: democratization versus commercialization. Now, of course, I don't mean to reduce a complex situation to a simplistic formula, but we have to find some way in a real world of wealth and power to find an equitable balance between private interests and the public good. We therefore face a fundamental question. Have we got the balance right in the world of books and libraries? Well, consider Google. In 2004, Google set out to digitize the collections of our greatest research libraries. It intended to use the data in a search service, which would make available snippets from the books, and those snippets would help users seeking information about a specific topic. So it looked great, and often Google would tell you where you, the user, could find the book in a nearby library. However, authors and publishers sued Google for infringing their copyrights. Google actually came first to Harvard. We said, yes, you can digitize our collections. But then they came back and they said, and we would also like to digitize books covered by copyright. Whereupon we said, no, but Michigan, Stanford, the University of California said yes. And so Google developed this database with millions of books covered by copyright. They were sued. It's a long, complicated story, which I followed actually very closely at the time, but it ended with something called the settlement. Now, the settlement was an agreement between Google and the plaintiffs, which actually transformed this search service into something completely different, a gigantic commercial library. And as a consequence, the research libraries that had originally supplied the books for free to Google were now being asked to buy back access to their own books in digitized form at a price that Google would set, a price that could escalate out of control like the prices of academic journals. The cost could really have closed access to information of the kind that are kept in research libraries, because the settlement didn't make any, took no account of the public good. There was no provision for settlement, for oversight by public authorities. It was, in fact, a monopoly of a new kind, a monopoly of access to knowledge in digital form. Well, fortunately, a New York district court refused to authorize this settlement on the grounds that it was an infringement of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and therefore Google Book Search, as it was called, is dead. It was, though, an audacious enterprise, in some ways a thrilling enterprise, and it raised the prospect of finding a democratic alternative to a commercial operation. In the era of print, this open access tradition goes back to the founding of the Boston Public Library in 1848. What you see there is the inscription over the main entrance, which says, "Free to all." Now that we have entered the digital age, we can do better than the Boston Public Library, although it's a great place that I love dearly. We can make all of the material in all of our research libraries available to everyone free of charge. And that is the basic idea behind the Digital Public Library of America, or the DPLA, as I call it for short. On October 1st, 2010, long before Google Book Search was rejected by the court, a group of leaders from foundations, research libraries, and computer science met at Harvard to discuss the prospect of creating a digital public library of America. The foundations would combine forces to provide the funds, the libraries would cooperate to supply the books, and we would enlist computer scientists to do the hard work of designing the hardware. We created a steering committee, a secretariat with a small staff, and work groups scattered across the country. Thousands of people participated, and everything was discussed openly in large meetings in San Francisco, Chicago, in Washington, D.C. What you see here is an artist at work at one of those meetings designing the pictures or writing out phrases that illustrated some of the ideas that were suggested in the course of the meetings. And so the result would be a huge bulletin board in which the ideas were accumulated. So there was a national debate, if you like. And it took place not just in meetings, but also through email, through listservs, through websites, wikis, and blogs. There was streaming and texting and tweeting, a running debate about every aspect of the plans in which everyone had a chance to be heard. And at the same time, there was enough coordination from the Berkman Center at Harvard for the DPLA to be launched successfully on April 18th, 2013. Now that it has celebrated its second anniversary, we're 2.5 years old, the collections of the DPLA include 10 million books and other objects, 4 times the amount that it offered when it first went online. They come from 1,600 institutions located in all 50 states, and they're being widely used. Millions of visitors have consulted the DPLA's website, which, by the way, is dp.la, and they come from every country in the world except North Korea, Chad, and Western Sahara. The DPLA's collections include material in 500 languages. By clicking on the website, and that's what it looks like, you can call up the texts of books, but you can do much more. You can browse through all the collections by place and by time period. So you can click on a place and read everything in the collections relative to that place, or you can choose a time period and read the relevant literature there. You can also wander through virtual exhibitions, which are particularly popular in secondary schools. And you can make use of all sorts of apps, which are constantly being grafted onto the system by independent innovators. Just people are thinking of things that they can hook up with the DPLA. So how should you envisage the DPLA? Not as a grand edifice with an imposing dome erected over a gigantic database, but rather as a distributed system, that is, a horizontal network that links up a digital collections in libraries, archives, and museums in such a manner that users can get access to a document with one click of an electronic device. Now incorporated as a non-profit enterprise, the DPLA has headquarters with a small staff in Boston, but it's not a top-down organization. Its horizontality corresponds to its democratic spirit and its basic goal, namely to make the cultural heritage of America available free of charge to all Americans and to everyone in the world. Far from intending to serve as an exclusive audience, such as the libraries and the elite who have access to the famous university libraries, the DPLA is designed to meet the needs of many different publics. Students of all ages, seniors in homes for the elderly, researchers who have no institutional affiliation, and people who really want to deepen their enjoyment of literature. It's organized in what we call hubs that extend its services like the spokes of a wheel. Content hubs, such as Harvard, the Smithsonian Institution, and the New York Public Library, provide digitized material from their enormous collections. Service hubs aggregate other collections and develop networks at the state level. So far, they exist in 25 states, and we hope that soon all 50 states will have service hubs. they make special efforts to reach people in small communities, working with local public libraries. The libraries invite everyone in a town or an urban neighborhood to bring in diaries, letters, family photographs, and other items that they may have stored in their attics or in trunks. The material is digitized, it's supplied with metadata, curated, and preserved. In this way, communities sharpen their awareness of their own culture and history, and at the same time, their local collections are integrated in a national network which grows organically every day. A new program has just been funded to develop community-based digital repositories and new advanced software for the back end or collective tissue that unites the system. Now, of course, the DPLA cannot reach every town in the United States. It relies on volunteers, including a small army of community reps, as we call them, who stimulate activities within designated areas. There are now 300 community reps scattered through all 50 states, and the DPLA is also developing a program to train librarians in public libraries to acquire the special skills that will be needed to launch digital projects in their own communities. Here is an example of material available to users who are interested in small town life in one state, Minnesota, or who are interested in agriculture and agronomy. You click on a site and you get more and more information as you hunt deeper. Many of these services are aimed at schools. The DPLA recently formed a partnership with the public broadcasting system to provide specially designed and curated materials to teachers and students. And in another new program, so we keep getting new grants and new programs to extend our activities. According to this one, it was just announced at the White House on April 30th, the DPLA will cooperate with publishing houses to provide free e-books along with reading tablets and other devices to children in low-income families. Now, of course, all of these new programs, and the new ones are announced every month, depend on the most advanced technology. I won't try to describe the DPLA's technological infrastructure, but I should emphasize that it, too, was a volunteer effort conducted on a national scale. For 2.5 years, 1,100 computer scientists submitted ideas which were combined and integrated by a team of experts at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And when the system went online live, it functioned flawlessly. It's also designed to be interoperable with Europeana, the system to integrate digital collections within the European Union. And it has a special API, an application programming interface built into its structure. So that's indicated by the top of those 3 gold bars. We've been really surprised at the enormous use of this API. It gets 3 million hits per month, and people enjoy just making up their own inventions, which then can be used as part of the DPLA. So we've got lots of innovative apps. One such app that's my favorite is called Bookshelf, and it creates the possibility of digital browsing. I'm sure most of you at one time or another went into a library looking for a particular book. If you were allowed in the shelves, you thought you'd have a look at the books next to it and next to them. Well, of course you can't do that anymore, either because you're not allowed in the stacks or because books are kept in off-site storage. But we can bring them together digitally. So What you see here, it's vertical. Imagine it as horizontal. It's a series of books spines. You go to the book you want to find, click on it, or click on the books next door to it, lying next to it, according to the way we put them together digitally. You can click on their table of contents, search through their actual substance, and so you can browse digitally. It's really better even, I think, than browsing in the stacks. And other apps are quite fascinating. Here's one that shows a montage of images about guitars. Another one has to do with maps of Chicago, which makes it possible to study urban space on both a macro and a micro level. I could go on and on. But the point is that in these and other outreach projects, the DPLA hopes to engage with its readers. Instead of simply making material available and expecting them to step up and use it, it seeks to interact with them and to enlist them in shaping its growth. Now, of course, the DPLA faces plenty of problems. Having depended on support from foundations since 2010, it needs to develop a long-term business plan. Its technology requires constant maintenance and improvement. And as it increases in size and scope, it must resolve issues of governance and administration. But the biggest problem, strange as it may seem, is legal. The DPLA must respect copyright. The copyright now covers books for the life of the author plus 70 years. That is, in most cases, for more than a century. Most literature from the 20th century, everything after 1964, and most books published after 1923, is therefore excluded from the public domain and can't figure in the DPLA's collections. Now, there may be ways around this difficulty as case law evolves in American courts, so there's grounds for some optimism. Some recent court decisions favor a broad construction of fair use, that is, digital lending for certain non-commercial purposes in accordance with its Clause 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, which has got a huge legal literature growing up around it. But for the moment, the DPLA is hoping that authors will voluntarily turn over the use of their copyrights after the commercial viability of their books has been exhausted. A new organization called the Authors Alliance has launched a campaign to persuade authors to make their books available online at some point after publication through the DPLA and Creative Commons licenses. So far, the response to this, it's just been announced, is quite encouraging. It may sound naive, but I think it's possible for the DPLA to satisfy authors and readers alike by bringing them together digitally. Despite the pressure of commercialization, therefore, the DPLA has tapped a vein of public spirit that is both idealistic and pragmatic. It draws inspiration from the ideals of the Enlightenment, but it's designed to serve the needs of the 21st century. And at a time of disgust with the dysfunction of Washington, it has proved that it can get the job done by independent initiative. You should not think of it as a digital version of the Library of Congress. It's a new kind of library altogether, not just in its technology, but also in its organization and its spirit. It will operate simultaneously on many levels: personal, local, national, and international. It's already functioning successfully, and it will continue to acquire new functions with ever-expanding collections for many generations. Now, of course, technology will also continue to change. and the DPLA will have to change with the technology far into the future. But if we can get it right now, we can help shape that future. For the first time in history, we can make the cultural heritage of humanity available to all humans. We have the technology, the know-how, the resources, and the will. We have taken the first steps, and now we have to get the job done.